The famous passage from the book of Isaiah was written before the exile in Babylon, sometime in the 8th century before Christ. It reflects a concern when a nation is overly dependent on the use of force, as well as the need to rely on God. This is Isaiah, 2nd chapter, 1st to the 5th verses. Future house of God. The word that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many people. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Judgment pronounced on arrogance. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord.
Our gospel reading this morning comes from Matthew's gospel, and it is a gospel lesson which speaks of the importance of being prepared. The importance of being prepared. Jesus is speaking, and he speaks here about the day of the Lord's coming. Hear these words. But about that day and hour no one knows, whether the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then two will be in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together. One will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this. If the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would have not let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard and the spaces in between prepare us as we seek to be a people of peace. Amen. If you travel north to New England and then well west of Boston to the Berkshires, at the end of Route 2 you will find an old industrial city, North Adams. And in the center of town you will find a large complex of brick buildings, factories and mills in days gone by. The buildings that stand there now at the juncture of the north and south branches of the Hoosick River was built on a site originally occupied by the Arnold Print Works, a textile mill which produced printed cloth. Among other things, the Arnold brothers had contracts to provide Union Army uniforms during the Civil War. Tragedy struck in 1876, and 8 of the buildings were ravaged by fire. Over time, the Arnolds rebuilt them and added other buildings to the complex. The company grew to become the center of life for North Adams, employing over 3,000 workers at its peak. But as cloth making and printing moved to the south to take advantage of lower costs, Arnold Print Works finally closed shop in 1942. But all was not over for those venerable old buildings. The Sprague Electric Company bought them and began to make electrical equipment, including capacitors. They also had a substantial R&D department and began making the trigger mechanisms for atomic bombs. Once again, though, the change in the economy led to the exporting of their product, the exporting of electronics manufacturing, and the doors were once again closed in 1985. But wait, there's more. The next year, art museum staff from Williams College fell upon the site as they hunted for a facility big enough to display the very large installations of art that they had, especially the modern and contemporary art pieces, objects way too big for conventional museum space. And so began the process that in time led to the purchase of those buildings and the opening in 1999 of the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, what's commonly referred to now as MassMoCA. Today, it is considered one of the premier such gallery and performing arts spaces in the entire nation, if not indeed the entire world. What once was a space for creating the things of war, uniforms, and parts for atomic weaponry, has become a center for art and the peaceful expression of human dreams and desires. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, atomic weaponry into art. And so we enter with this reading from Isaiah into the Advent season, that time in which we prepare our hearts and minds for the coming of Christ, the one we call the Prince of Peace. Each year as we journey through this season, we reflect on 4 themes: peace, hope, joy, and love. And each year we are joined by various companions from the past, men and women who guide us along the path to Bethlehem. And one of those companions, year after year, is the Hebrew scripture prophet Isaiah, the one responsible for the powerful vision of peace in our first reading this morning. We don't know a lot about Isaiah. His call to be a prophet is recorded in chapter 6 of the book bearing his name. It was a dramatic vision, one he had in the temple with angels and bright lights. But it also pointed the way towards a career that would be marked by controversy. It is said that his tongue was touched by one of the hot coals on the altar, symbolic of the way his words would set aflame the hearts of the Jerusalemites. Most, if not all, of his career was spent in Jerusalem, mostly between the years 742 and 701 BCE. Long before, the united kingdom of David and his son Solomon had split into 2 countries, Israel to the north and Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, to the south. And both of these tiny, tiny countries were caught in the crossroads of the ancient Near East, surrounded by the mighty powers of Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. Huge military powers compared to these tiny little nations. Powerful nations who were constantly at war with one another and with their neighbors and anyone who just happened to get in between. Such was the fate of Judah. Judah was involved in numerous battles and diplomatic maneuverings. But Isaiah objected. When the kings of Judah looked to the large military powers for protection, he warned against it. Like an ancient version of George Washington, who famously warned against foreign entanglements in his farewell address. "My ardent desire," said the outgoing first president, "and my aim has been to keep the United States free from political connection with every other country, to see that they may be independent of all and under the influence of none." Isaiah felt much the same way about his own country, Judah. "Avoid such alliances," he said. "They only lead to death and destruction." But the kings of Judah ignored his warnings. If Egypt was threatening Judah from the south, her kings turned to Assyria in the north. If Assyria was the aggressor, they turned to Babylon in the east for protection. Again and again, Isaiah warned of the dangers inherent in these military alliances. But, as well-known scholar Abraham Heschel wrote, reliance on such power meant the nation demonstrated a belief that human beings rather than God, weapons rather than attachment to God, determined the destiny of nations. The leaders of Judah refused to listen to Isaiah. They refused to understand that the road to peace is not paved with weapons and warfare. The way to peace is not paved with swords and spears. But that's not how it all turned out. After decades and decades of trying to play both ends against the middle, after decades and decades of wars and skirmishes, tiny Judah was finally overrun by powerful Babylon. Its leading citizens were sent into exile 800 miles away, and Jerusalem was ransacked, destroyed, and the temple absolutely lay in ruins. It was while in Babylon that many of the sayings and oracles of Isaiah were finally gathered and preserved in writing. And there, now perhaps made wiser by their experience, Isaiah's warning about relying on warfare and violence began to make some sense. But for those words, strength of warning, they also carried some real hope, like that found in our passage this morning. A hopeful reminder that though things seemed very bleak, the day would come when swords would be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. The day would come when nations would no longer lift up swords in anger, nor would they learn war anymore. There would be peace. There would be lasting peace. These were the words of Isaiah. And then, after that vision, I hope you heard the invitation. For there is an invitation there that is not only pertinent in Isaiah's time or in the time of exile, but an invitation for those of us who live in our own time, those of us who live right here on Sanibel, in Fort Myers, at Shell Point, those of us who live December 1st, 2019, an invitation to remember that though we live in times that are oft conflicted and difficult, there is a way out. Walk, says Isaiah, walk in the light of the Lord. Walk in the light of the Lord. Here then, sisters and brothers, is the key to peace for our time as well. Here is the key not just to international peace, but peace between races, peace between men and women and those who claim no gender, peace between the young and the old, peace between all people. For ultimately, all peace boils down to individual people, to you and to me, making the choice to either love or to hate, to walk in the light or to stay cloaked in the darkness. Look, I am not naive as to think that all the world's problems can be settled on a one-to-one basis. There are systems and governments and societal structures that desperately need to be reformed. But it all starts on an individual basis. What you and I do makes a difference. When you and I are willing to be our own peaceful selves, when you and I are willing to beat our own versions of swords and spears into plowshares and pruning hooks, peace will have a chance. Whether those swords and spears are literal weapons or hateful words or prejudicial thoughts. Peace will have a chance when we choose to walk in the light. Susan Kennedy lives in Miami Gardens, right here in Florida, not much more than 90 miles away. She is doing just that. She's walking in the light. Back in 2016, little 6-year-old King Carter, one of her neighbors, was killed by gunfire as he was walking to buy some candy at the neighborhood drugstore. When Susan heard about it, she says it felt like it was her own child who had been killed. The incident and others like it turned into literal nightmares for Susan. So she consulted her pastor. She wanted to do something to address the problem of gun violence in her own city, in her own neighborhood. He advised her to pray on it. As she prayed about it, a phrase kept entering her mind. Donate a bullet, save a life. Donate a bullet, save a life. Every night, that phrase kept coming to her. In time, that led to her creating an organization called Bullets for Life, a group dedicated to taking bullets, safely dismantling them, and turning them into jewelry. So she began to walk the neighborhoods, those in particular that had been most impacted by street violence, asking folks, many of them complete strangers, for their bullets. It's one less life taken, she says, if somebody donates bullets to me. Today, thousands of bullets have been donated to the cause, and hundreds of individuals have joined in the effort, some of them well beyond Miami, turning bullets into bracelets. Every time a bracelet is purchased from the organization, they give one to a victim of gun violence, a mother or daughter or son of someone who's been gunned down. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, atomic weaponry into art. bullets into bracelets. Peace doesn't come overnight. But when we walk in the light of the Lord, when we do our part to help make it a reality, peace will come. For the God we celebrate in this Advent season is a God of peace and a God of justice. That's what Isaiah says over and over and over again. That's why we turn to Isaiah for guidance and strength as we work for peace and seek to walk in the light. I know there are times it might not seem like what you can do will make much of a difference. But it can, and it does. Sharita Small, whose son Zamari was killed by a stray bullet, wears one of those bracelets. And she says, every bullet you see in a bracelet, that's a bullet that ain't in somebody's child. That's a bullet that ain't in somebody's